Good morning. Yeah, we're live. Okay, if we could get everyone sitting, if you're inclined to do so. We're glad you're here. It was announced that Bob would be looking after the lesson this morning, but for both of us it worked better that we swapped it Sunday for Sunday. So he will be on for next Sunday, and we will do our final session today on medieval church history. So that was the medieval time is a turbulent time, and a lot of legend. It's sometimes as you study, it's hard to figure out what is factual, what is legend, what is truth, and you maybe have more discretion that way than I do, but I'm kind of intrigued by some of this stuff. But God is not surprised by any of it. He is the all-knowing one. And just a few verses that talk about God's all-knowing character. From Isaiah 40. Hast thou not known, hast thou not heard that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary. There is no searching of his understanding. He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might he increaseth strength. Even the youths shall faint. Maddox could faint. Even the youths shall faint and grow weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But they that wait upon the Lord shall what? Shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. And in the book of Romans, Paul, around verse or chapter 10, 11, he is talking of how the Jewish saints and the church people, or the people of Gentile church, how they've been amalgamated or joined into one body. And as he ponders that, he finally just breaks out into praise. He says, "Oh, the depths of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. For who hath not known the mind of the Lord, or who hath been his counselor? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever." Then he adds, "Amen. So will it be." So we ended up last time talking about Thomas of Aquinas. And we said that he was probably the greatest educator and scholar of the medieval age. And that was somewhat before the great universities had really got going. And I thought it would be good to maybe explain a little bit some of these names that we read of. They're kind of strange names. So Thomas Aquinas, really what that name, Thomas of Aquino. It's where he lived. And that just sort of got incorporated into his name. Anyone here read the Imitation of Christ? Who wrote that? Thomas à Kempis. Right. And what that name means, Thomas of Kempis. His actual name was Thomas Hammerkin. And we read of Francis of Assisi. His name was actually Francisco Bernardone. So a lot of the names, the places where they resided are incorporated into their name. And sometimes that's good to know, because that helps us know where they were actually from. And we said that Thomas, that the dumb ox Thomas, he brought Aristotle's thinking into his reasoning. And Aristotle was big on human reason. And it's interesting that at that same time, the big universities of Europe were just getting going. I did a little bit of study on that, and by the year 1100, Oxford was offering a few classes. At that time, she was not deemed a university, but she was offering classes. And shortly behind was Cambridge. And over across the English Channel in Paris, the university was going there. And these schools started as schools of divinity. So they didn't teach math or science or engineering. They taught things that pertained to the ministry. And some of those things were a little bit different than what we would think of a Bible school, but they taught rhetoric, logic, philosophy, and theology. And so it was more the thinking kind of, abstract thinking kind of things that were happening, particularly at Oxford.
What is rhetoric?
Talking. Speaking. So we want to look at then perhaps Oxford's greatest scholar. And he was born in 1330, and we know him more for his work as a Bible translator into English. But his name was John, how do you say the name, Wycliffe or Wycliffe?
It's been said all ways.
Okay. We'll call him Wycliffe then. Yes, well, I remember him talking about, and Wycliffe, he entered Oxford at the age of 14. Very, very bright student. But his stay there was interfered with by the Black Death. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the bubonic plague later. But it did interfere with some of his progress. And you talk of Mr. Pitt. The followers of Wycliffe were called Lollards. And I can remember Mr. Pitt calling them Lollards. Mr. Pitt was my social studies teacher in Maryfield High School. Have very good memories of Mr. Pitt's teaching, as I do of all of my teachers, in case there are some listening. So, and Wycliffe, he was a student of the Bible, and he spoke out against the church militant in three particular areas. These were how the church was established. And the church of the day believed in the selling of indulgences, in keeping of the Mass, and Wycliffe had problems with some of those things. He believed how the Bible taught that those that were predestined were elected of God, and through justification by faith were brought into the life of the church. He also argued against the way that the administering of the Eucharist. And he had a problem with this thing called transubstantiation. Great big word. Who can define that in very simple terms?
It meant that the wine and the bread actually turned into the blood and body of Christ.
Yeah, that's how I would understand it too. Are we understanding that right, Wilson?
Yeah, that's what it means.
Okay. Right. And so that particularly the reformers had a struggle with that. And that was probably the biggest point on which the reformers differed from the mother church on that aspect of the Eucharist. And Wycliffe had a problem with the way the scriptures were viewed. Up to that point, it was only the monks and the educated that could read the Bible because it was written primarily in Latin and Greek. And the common people did not know those languages. And so he believed in the final authority of Scripture, and he believed that the common people should be able to read and understand the Bible. And so that's what, towards the end of his life, just in the last few years, after he had been expelled from Oxford, expelled from the church, he translated the Bible into Midland English. How many of you read Chaucer in school? I remember Chaucer. Karen remembers Chaucer. I'm trying to think what that was called. Canterbury Tales, right? And unless it was interpreted to you, you probably would only understand 10% of what was written. The English is so different than today's. And Wycliffe and Chaucer were contemporaries, and they had many of common friends. And Midland English was the English spoken in London. And so he translated the Bible. So it was not the primary Bible for very long because the English was rapidly changing. And by the time King James had translated it, or his men had translated it in the 1600s, the English was quite different, even though at that time it was still quite different from ours. Eventually, Wycliffe died of a stroke. And in his mind, he never left the mother church. He opposed it on many fronts, but he never left it. And yet the church, because of his writings and because of his teachings, they disowned him. And 40 years after his death, his bones were exhumed. They were dug up. And the church had a public ritual where his bones were burned. He was burned at the same as burned at the stake, and his ashes thrown into a river that flowed out to the sea. But his teachings were like his ashes. Those ashes went out to the sea and around the world, and so did his teachings. There's an interesting account. Queen Anne of Bohemia. Where's Bohemia, Bob? Which country, do you know?
Germany?
Czechoslovakia, actually. She was, Queen Anne, she was married at a very young age, at the age of 15. She was 16. Her husband was King Richard. He was 15. But she was a very devout woman. She loved the scriptures. She could read the Bible in 3 languages. She was well taught, obviously, or well educated. And she had heard of the teachings of Wycliffe in Oxford. And she sent students from Bohemia or Czechoslovakia to Oxford. They were trained. They came home to Prague. And there they made disciples of the Bohemian people. One of these disciples was John Huss. And John Huss would go on to be a tremendous reformer in Europe. And he started the Hussite movement, or we might know it as the Moravians. And the Moravians were responsible for spreading the gospel throughout much of Europe and even North America. And if you've read the biography, let's say, of John Wesley, you would know that he was led to the Lord by two Moravian men, Peter Böhler and Count von Zinzendorf. So, the influence of Oxford and her message was very great. Whitefield, too, was saved at Oxford. So we go back to London. Reformation took place there, too. After Wycliffe's death, things carried on, but the Reformation, Luther's teaching, started to infiltrate, and there was tremendous upheaval. And three men in particular were at the forefront of this Reformation. And this is a sort of more in Bob's time period already, but I asked him, he said he wouldn't be talking about this, so I'll go into this a little bit. There's a fellow by the name of Little Bilney. You read of Little Bilney, Thomas Bilney? He was, though he later became very educated, he was a very simple man, and he had a heart. As he was attending Cambridge University, and there was one of the profs that just grabbed his heart, and he wanted that man to be saved. And so he started praying for Hugh Latimer. And he had occasion to meet Latimer, and he just did not know how to present the gospel to Hugh Latimer. And finally he made arrangements that he would meet Latimer in the confessional. There were confessional booths. And so the penitent would sit in there and confess his wrongs and his sins to the priest. And so Little Bilney was in the confessional, and Hugh Latimer was the presiding priest. And this happened a number of times. And the one verse that Little Bilney quoted time after time, Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. And eventually that verse burned into the heart of Hugh Latimer, and he was saved. Another fellow, same time, Bishop Ridley. And Latimer and Ridley both believed in justification by faith, and they were brought before tribunals, they were brought before the courts, and eventually they were condemned. Their teachings were believed to be heretical, and together they were condemned to be burned. The night of his death, his brother offered to attend to Bishop Ridley, because he wouldn't be able to sleep, he'd be worked up, and yet Ridley said, I don't need anyone. I will sleep like a little child tonight. And he did. And he and Latimer went to their deaths the next morning. Latimer was smiling. They just saw this as a translation. And they were hitched up to the pole. They were chained together by one chain. Gunpowder was tied, sacks of gunpowder around their neck, and the flame was lit. As the flame was lit, Latimer spoke in this manner. This is Fox's Book of Martyrs, in case I bought this book on Baffin Island. Of all the places to find a book like this. He said, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out. Tremendous things were to happen afterwards. I should tell you of one more. Bishop Cranmer. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the, next to the Pope, probably the most powerful churchman in Europe. And he too came under the influence of Luther's teaching. And he professed it openly and boldly. He too was condemned. But Latimer, or Mr. Cranmer, in an attempt to save his life, took a pen and he signed a note of recantation. He recanted. And he, for a brief period, he saved his life. But he was so conscience-stricken that later he went to the church authorities and said, I have changed my mind. No longer do I recant. I once again profess that we are saved by grace alone. And so he too was sentenced to be burnt. And as he prepared for his death, he told his friends his right arm was the member which had written the note to recant. And he said, it must be the first to burn. And he said, it will stand the test of fire, and you shall see it. And as they lit the fire, the one side burned more brightly than the other. And he put his arm across the fire, and he held it firm till the meat just dripped off of the arm. Yet it stood firm until he collapsed in the flames. God had given him grace, even though he had, for a while, weakened. Something big happened in Germany in 1440. We have our phones, and I have a Bible app on here. I think it probably has about 25 languages or more of the Bible, all on this little phone. And there's how many translations? You can pick whatever translation you want, and within seconds, you can find any text you want in any language, in any translation of the Bible. And we think, ooh, that's pretty big. But in 1440, something happened that was far more encompassing than these little phones. There, a boy was born, Johann Gutenberg, and he was gifted, we don't know if he was actually saved or not, but he was gifted in working with metals and in engraving. And God gave him a vision, or maybe not a vision, but just a desire to create something that would print faster than what people could write. And over the course of his experimentation, finally he had made a gadget that could print books. And mostly he printed Bibles. And I think the first Bible printed was one produced by William Tyndale. I think Bob maybe talked of him last time, or maybe he will. And I had something here I was going to read. Gutenberg's new process sparked a revolution in society and the church. Books could now be produced in quantities and at prices that had made them available to many people, not merely to scholars and monks. The resulting explosion of knowledge continues to accelerate in our day, and does it ever. In the church, the Protestant Reformation might have been impossible in pre-Gutenberg age. Indeed, the Reformation became in some ways a war of books, each party pointing out to errors of the others. Everything the Reformers said about the priesthood of all believers was noted in the assumption that people could have access to the Bible in their own language. Thus, Luther and other Reformers worked to translate the Scriptures so that no priest, pope, or council needed to stand between the plowboy and the Word of God. So that made quite a difference. Once people could have the Bibles in their own language and at an affordable price. COVID. It changed our world, didn't it? Quite a bit. And with the media, there was quite a hullabaloo caused by this little virus that affected so many. But in the year 1348, there was an epidemic in Europe that far, far exceeded anything we saw in COVID. I have such a collection of books here. It said about a third of all of Europe was wiped out by the Black Death. It came to Europe on a ship into Italy, carried the bacteria. It was carried by a black rat and a flea combination. And it's interesting, God used brown rats to drive away the bubonic plague. It's the plague itself is carried by black rats, and as brown rats moved in, they drove out the black rats, thus eradicating the plague, which was many years later. It's not a type of death that most of us would want to. I'm going to read a little bit here. What was this plague like? This unseen killer which so changed the 14th century world. The first symptoms of bubonic plague often appear within several days, writes a certain historian. They include headache, general feeling of weakness, followed by aches and chills in the upper leg and groin, white coating on the tongue, rapid pulse, slurred speech, confusion, fatigue, apathy, staggering gait. A blackish pustule usually will form at the point of the flea bite. By the third day, the lymph nodes begin to swell. The heart begins to flutter rapidly as it tries to pump blood through swollen, suffocating tissues. Hemorrhaging occurs, causing purplish blotches on the kin. The victim's nervous system begins to collapse, causing dreadful pain and bizarre neurological disorders. By the fourth or fifth day, wild anxiety and terror overtake the sufferer, and then a sense of resignation as the skin blackens and the rictus of death settles on the body. And particularly in the cities, getting rid of bodies became one of the biggest problems. In the city of London, they could not keep up even with mass graves. And bodies were stacked on the street like cordwood. Those would have been tremendously trying days. And yet, we read of people, church or church people, particularly women, that use this as a chance to minister. And these women were fearless. In the face of getting that disease, they did not back off. They would minister to the dying until they died themselves. What a testimony. What a thing we can learn. Now we travel to Italy. Has anyone here been in Italy? I haven't either. In 1452, a young lad was born. Another very interesting name. Not sure if I will say it right. Girolamo Savonarola. And if those of you that read Tozer probably are familiar with Savonarola. But he was a reformer. He never left the mother church. But he denounced some of the things that he saw in his own church that were so very evil, especially against the clergy. So many were living immoral lives, and they were greedy, and he spoke out against these things. He believed in justification by faith. He believed in the authority of scriptures. And even though he probably would not have fit into one of our churches here in North America because they thought differently than we do. And yet he came a long way towards a more genuine, simple Christian outlook, follower of Christ. And because he was so outspoken, the Pope himself dealt with Savonarola. And he offered him, if you will just be silent against the clergy, I will give you the cardinal's hat, a new position, high position in the church. And Savonarola just explained back, or just exclaimed, I want no hat but a crimson hat. And the crimson hat spoke of martyrdom. And he got his wish. He was hung, he was burned, and yet Luther attributed much to Savonarola. It was his teaching to a large part that pointed Luther to the truth. Savonarola said, you can separate me from the church militant, but you can never sever me from the church triumphant. Maybe we will one day have to make such a proclamation.
What do you mean by the church militant?
The church as you see it in the church triumphant is as God sees it. Now we're going to cross the Atlantic and how the gospel was brought to North America. I had some interesting little excerpts here. What do you think of when you think of Christopher Columbus? What do you know about Columbus? And most of us would probably know he was supposedly one of the first to go from Europe to North America, right? 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We know that's about as far as we know about Columbus. There's a side to Columbus that most of us don't know about. Unlike many sailors then and now, Christopher Columbus never used profanity. I found that interesting. During Columbus's voyages, the ship's crews observed religious rites. Every time they turned the half-hour glass, Their primary means of keeping time, they cried, "Blessed be the hour of our Savior's birth. Blessed be the Virgin Mary who bore him. Blessed be John who baptized him." They finished each day by singing vepers. I take it those are songs together, although reportedly out of tune. Not until his third voyage did Columbus actually land on American mainland. Seeing 4 rivers flowing from the landmass, he believed he had encountered the Garden of Eden. Remember how there was 4 rivers flowing into Eden or out of? He died in 1506, unaware that he had landed thousands of miles from the Indies. He thought he had found the Indies, yet he had found North America. And
So the Indies, what, like the West Indies?
I wasn't, that's why I just said Indies, because I wasn't sure if it was West or East. I forgot my social studies on that one. It's on the other side, anyways. He had figured it, actually, from biblical teaching, and I was reading about that, it's very bizarre how he figured, he used things written in the Bible to figure out how many miles it should be around the circumference of the earth. And he figured that somehow with a sixth was landmass and the other water, or like from that ratio of water to landmass, he somehow figured out the circumference of the earth, and thereby figuring how many days till he should hit the Indies. Strange way of figuring, but he was quite a bit off, but he was obviously a man of the sea. So for 7 years, Christopher Columbus, he was a very tall man, red-haired, an imposing figure. He was Italian, but he had this dream to sail across the ocean, and he expected to find land somewhere beyond. And there were not many that shared his belief. But he went to the courts of Spain. Ferdinand and Isabel were Christian monarchs. And for 7 years, he slunk around their courts, begging them to fund a trip for him to go to the unknown. And he assured them of great wealth. And one of the things that they wanted was to evangelize and to see more people come to know the Lord in the way that they understood. And finally, they said, "Yes, Columbus, we will fund a trip across the ocean." So he took the 3 ships. He himself sailed in the Santa Maria, and eventually they landed somewhere near Cuba on an island. And he planted the flag of Spain, and he committed that land to the God of his fathers. And he returned to the one ship got destroyed there on the rocks, and but 2 ships made it back. And on his next journey, his return journey, I think he brought 13 missionaries. And yes, I was going to read one other thing here. In the first 15 years after Spanish conquest of Mexico, oh no, that's not the right one. But anyways, within around a century, Spain had sent over 15,000 missionaries to North America. I found that amazing. And they were not missionaries maybe totally in the sense that we think. the sword and the cross were interchanged. And some of it is very bloody history, but Christ was proclaimed nonetheless. I found this interesting. Because of Columbus's voyage and the resulting Spanish evangelistic efforts, Latin America has a higher percentage of professing Christians than that of any other region in the world. So what, Latin America, what would that include, Alex? I'm not 100% sure.
Well, I think it goes like from Mexico to like Brazil, Argentina, to the very, very tip, which is like Punta de Fuego, Argentina.
Okay. So that would include South America. Okay. So that I was not aware that the church was that strong in those areas. So, and that we can, to a large part, thank Christopher Columbus. So that was a side that I was not familiar with. We go back to Scotland. In the year 1514, John Knox was born. Scotland was very turbulent. There was, depending on which side the monarchy sided with, is where sort of the church was headed. So if you had a Catholic queen or king, the land tended towards Catholicism. And if you had a Protestant-leaning king or queen, the land was Protestant. And it seemed like those transitions never went very smooth. It was accompanied with the sword. And what did they call the church? The kerk? Kerk. I remember Ken Moore. Kerk? K-I-R-K. Anyways, however you would say that word. And into those times was born this John Knox. And he was very narrow-minded. He was intolerant. He was hard to live with. Very outspoken. And yet he also had a generous heart and a caring heart. A very complex man, obviously. And as a young man, he was captured by the French, and he spent 19 months on a galley ship. And if you were a slave on a galley ship, when the wind wasn't blowing, and here on the prairies, this would be very rare. It would seem. But maybe if you were on the ship, you would think it was often. But when there was no wind, then these slaves, there was 6 men to an oar. And they would, usually there was 25 oars, and they would propel the ship. And just hour after hour, they had to row. And Knox learned some very bitter lessons in the galley ship. He was liberated by the English. He taught, or he preached actually in England for a while, returned to Scotland, exiled out of Scotland, spent time with John Calvin in Geneva. And as the Reformation fires burned in Scotland, he was invited to return. And return he did. And somebody described his preaching. In his sermons, Knox typically spent half hour calmly exegeting a biblical passage. Then he applied the text to the Scottish situation. He would become active and vigorous and violently pound the pulpit. Said one note-taker, "He made me so to tremble that I could not hold a pen to write." He obviously thundered. and thunder he did. And yet by the time he died, the discouraged Christians of Scotland had been encouraged. And tremendous things happened. That was in Scotland. I don't know if Bob was going to talk about this, but maybe now he won't, unless he corrects me. I want to talk a little bit about the Anabaptists. What does that term mean to you, Anabaptist?
Baptized as a believer, not just as a child?
Right, that would, yeah. Really, it means re-baptized. Yes, baptized again. So, and some of us have those bloodlines in our veins. So I thought maybe it would be interesting just to spend a few minutes talking about how the Anabaptists came to be. So some of the key reformers would have been Luther, and then Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich, right? And so three men met together in Zurich, Switzerland. One was Conrad Grebel, the other Felix Manz, and Ulrich Zwingli. And together they were studying the scriptures. They were trying to restore New Testament Christianity to their region. And eventually, Manz and Grebel split from Zwingli because Zwingli did not agree on this idea of being rebaptized. And actually, he became very hostile to their ideas. And these Anabaptists primarily were focused on these things: baptism on the confession of faith. So as an infant, you could not be baptized on the confession of your faith. You might be baptized on the confession of your parents' faith, but the infant himself would not know what he was doing. They believed in the peaceful lifestyle. We've all heard of pacifism, right? We maybe haven't always seen it, but we have heard of it. They believed in the separation of state and church. And I've had young Bible school students ask me, like, have you read about the incident at Munster regarding the Anabaptists? It's sad to say I have. And I just hope that whets your appetite. You read, you find the information. What happened at Munster? I'll just give you a little clue. They set up what they believed to be the New Jerusalem. And the state did not agree there would be a New Jerusalem. And the state saw to it that this city got turned around, and it was very, very bloody. So that has left a blemish on the Anabaptists up to this day, the incident at Munster. Later in the Netherlands, Menno Simons heard of the teaching of Grebel and Manz, and he furthered the cause, and those he discipled were called Mennonites. And the movement spread through all of Europe. And they were one of the first churches, or maybe the first church, who believed in autonomous, or like that churches govern themselves. They were not as parts of organizations. And so they never really worked together in unity. There would just be parcels of believers here, there, and everywhere, and it never worked as an organized unit. And so didn't spread maybe as rapidly as it could have, but eventually persecution drove the Mennonites to the Ukraine, to Moravia, later to North America, Paraguay, Bolivia, Mexico, Steinbach, Kola, Maryfield. Maybe it wasn't persecution. But now Mennonites and Anabaptists, they cover the globe. Because of a little prayer meeting or prayer incident that happened in Zurich. We have a few minutes left. Let's talk about everyday life in the medieval age. Can you imagine what it must have been like to live like in the 1300s, 1200s? No electricity, no cars. I think we would have had a real culture shock. I have something here that told me all about it. We'll go on the fly. Their homes would have been very simple. Dirt floors. In the middle of the house would have been a hearth with no continuous chimney, but there would have been a hole in the roof, and your house was continually smoke-filled. And in the middle of on that fire was a pot, and their staple food was porridge, and they would eat bread. And into this porridge pot, depending on the season, they would throw whatever seasonings or vegetables would go in there. Protein was virtually non-existent. And their house, Bob might remember, old Gus Quebecki, his house could have been medieval. Because the animals lived in your house with you. And some more wealthy ones maybe had a partition, but in many, the chickens and the goats were in there with you. Yeah, it is becoming more normal, isn't it? But so life would have been no windows, like they would have had openings with shutters, but nothing to cover it, no glass. So the breeze could blow through, or you just shut them. Very different. Birthing happened at home. Many children would die in childbirth. And the church had an influence on every factor or facet of life. And so even as a child was being born, the priest would try to be there to christen this child. And so many children, by the time they were birthed, had died. So even as the child but once the head and shoulders were exposed, the christening waters were already being dumped on the child, lest the child die and it not be christened. So it's interesting, the mother could not go to church for around 6 weeks after the child was born, they called it churching period. And this was the period for her purification from childbirth so that she could once more enter the public life. I found marriage very interesting. Marriages were typically not because of romance. They were planned marriages. And so things like financial benefits, or social benefits, or political benefits, you were married to someone that would help vault you into a higher sphere of life. And so the parents were very careful who they chose. And you might not be that impressed with who you were given, but your parents or neighbors, whoever, were very concerned about those things. And a lot of the families would become very large if children lived. Like I was reading here about Catherine of Siena, Siena. She was the 24th of 25 children. That must have been a very busy mother. Yes, and then the last thing of this burial. Most people did not live to be very old, and there was no such thing as caskets. They were just sewn into a shroud, placed on a bier. When I talked, one time I was talking to Dieter about a bier, and he like, what is he talking about? So I was able to take him to my King James Bible and explain to him that Jesus, it says, touched the bier of the widow of Nain's, her son, and he was raised from the dead. So that is a biblical word, B-I-E-R. And so then these people were just a shallow grave for their eternal rest. So that's, our time is up. That's what I'm not sure if I covered the right things on medieval history, but I have found it very fascinating. And I will continue reading that. And if you are interested, here is a book. If you want a volume to read and you have lots of time, Martyr's Mirror. That's a book, has a fair bit to do about the Anabaptist and her martyrs. It's similar to Fox's Book of Martyrs, and many of the people